Well, hopefully nobody has wonderful animations or other cool stuff.
So.
My slides are all boring.
I don't know how to make it full screen. Here? No. Here?
What? No, what's the issue?
Make it full screen.
Oh. No, I think this is as good as, well, there was some function key, F, whatever, but some function may implode the notebook.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that one's, yeah.
Okay. Then we can, but how to, yes. Okay, got it. Okay. Then where's page up?
Do we have blue sheets? No. Okay, let me take care of that. I'll do it.
But we, why? Oh, yeah. So this time we should start.
Yep.
Okay. Oh. Sorry for the noise. Okay, here we are. Anima session for Thailand, actually, wrong spell. So this is Monday, and we have one session for 2 hours. This is Anima working group, autonomic networking integrated model and approach. So if you're happy in the wrong room, still have time to run for your right room. This is a note well, everybody should already read it. If you don't, please do. So blue sheet is going around. Please make sure you're signed before you leave the room. And we need minutes taker. Any volunteer for minutes taker? Once? Bing, thanks again. This is support for remote participation, and all slides already uploaded on the website with materials from IETF. And mailing list, as usual, it should be the first working place. So everybody should have the, invoke the discussing on there and take participant for mailing list discussing. Normally we give the priority for those topics already have discussing in mailing lists during the IETF meeting cycles. This working group is co-chaired by me, Xinjiang, and Terence Eckert. You can find all the information on the data tracker. This is the meeting agenda. We have very full agenda for today. First, the working group document. We have 3 working group document need update, autonomic control plan, bootstrap remote secure key infrastructure, and constraint virtual artifacts for bootstrapping protocols. Each of them have 10 minutes, but since they are working group document, they have priority over the other presentations, so they may take more time if that's needed. Then we have our potential new charter unscribing. So it's discussing what we are going to do for next stage. Some proposed text will be explained by Curtis. And then we have those non-working group work items. First, information distribution in autonomic networking. Then that's the DNS SD compatible service discovered in GRASP. Actually, that's combined with the number 9 auto configuration of NOC service in SAP networks via GRASP. So Thanks, Teres, to make me confused. He applied for 2 slots, but he decided to combine them together and, be 1 slide. So I guess you have 10 minutes for that too. Then number 6, that's the trust networking and procedures for autonomic networking. Brisky is for smart pledges. And the last constraint, join prefix for bootstrapping protocols. Hopefully we have enough time to just finish all those agenda on time. Any agenda push? Once, twice, go. Give a very short brief for the working group status. We have 2 RFCs published in this May, so that's the voucher and the stable connectivities. And we actually have 3 documents, 2 documents missing right there. Actually, they already passed the publishing procedure for a very long time last year. That's GRASP and also the prefix ad management. They will be published as long as their dependency document get published. And the autonomic control plan is already submitted for publication and it's under the ISG investigation. It's in the 80 situation and has 3 discussed to resolve. And the reference model has been submitted to ISG in this May. It's in reverse ID needed situation and already has enough positions to pass the ISG evaluation. And we have one more Brisky actually submitted to ISG for publication in August and still waiting for AD write-up. Some work for you. And we have 2 drafts in the working group stage. GRASP API adopted in December last year. It's in version 2 at this moment. And the constraint voucher adopted in May and will make updates in this meeting. All right, that's it. So,
Ignas Bogdanas, would you like to discuss especially those 3 documents in more detail right now, or will that be a slot later?
I mean, we have Brisky in update today. We also have the constraint virtual update today. So if that's for those 2, you can save it for later. Otherwise, please do.
So, well, from my side, it's about ACP one. It has 2 serious discusses, and what are your plans of progressing with that?
Actually, next presentation is for ACP. Okay.
Brusky also, I would assume.
Yeah.
There will be a dedicated slot. That's fine.
We have that update presentations. So next will be ACP. Yeah. Oh,
Yes,
the screen there is not on.
The speaker screen shows black font on black background. So let me see if I can get started. Okay.
Yeah, that's screen still.
Maybe this? Yeah.
The button here.
Oh, I can choose between Netflix, YouTube, and
Oh, you can. Okay.
okay. So wanted to give updates since IETF 102. That was dash 16. Now we're at 1718. So the incorporated feedback is from Alicia, Elwin for Jenard, Frank Chelling from Sectir, and a fix from Pascal. And I'm going to talk about the backlog at the end of the presentation. So the main changes from 16 to 18 that are, interesting enough to be brought up in front here. Mostly technical elements. There was a lot of textual improvement, of course, that I don't want to go into detail. Use RFC diff, please. So we had to introduce an option in the certificate to indicate that the address of the device is not assigned through the certificate itself, because typically the ACP certificate will carry the ACP address, but then you have nodes, for example, in the NOC that are attached through normal ACP Connect subnet, and they would get their local part from local procedures, so they wouldn't be fixed by the certificate, and we hadn't foreseen that, so that's now done by indicating in the certificate that try to figure out your ACP local address part differently, and then of course in the certificate check we wanted to make sure that we say, okay, this is supported if during the enrollment of the device it's made clear that it is not taking its ACP address from the registration process but locally, then that is explicitly shown in the certificate and therefore security-wise permitted. We don't currently have an AI mechanism that relies on taking the ACP address of a peer from the certificate, so this is fine and won't change anything. The only use that we currently have is that the node itself learns its own address from the ACP address. So if it sees a 0 there, then it would know I have to figure out my ACP address differently. And we do know how to do that for NOC devices that are connected via ACP Connect. So that was kind of the main technical point that came out of the discusses. Then clearing up any remaining confusion about what is normative in the document and what is informative. And so I think one of the main pain point was the requirement section, which goes back to the fact that in the current charter, we were not allowed to have separate requirement documents. So then we're said, put the requirements into the actual solution document. So we had this informational requirements section in there just to stage within the working group what we actually are working against, right? What is it that we're trying to achieve with the ACP in a high-level fashion? And that's basically what still the current requirement section is. So that is informative, like typically any requirements document that other working groups are producing is true, and then the solution is normative. And yeah, the requirement section was using words must and should, and so those obviously are not 2119 normative requirements words, so I changed them to underscore, if that's hopefully a good way to make clear that they're just, requirements, solution requirements, but not a normative must and should. So yeah, then also there were, I think, several reviewers finally with Alicia saying that, we should make sure that we don't have too much futures in the normative section. So I try to remove all that is unnecessary. And then I created Appendix A10 for those pieces that really are important to keep documented about futures, so that any future work that we're doing actually knows what the ACP needs in that case. And I think I'll show one or two things in the coming slides. So really try to straighten up the normative part to really only be what we know must be done. That included, for example, on the technical side, primarily this RSUB element that also comes up in the security review right now. So that is really an important thing right now, and not only for the future. So one of the things is that it helps a lot to avoid any undesired ULA hashes when we're assigning addresses.
Alyssa Cooper, thank you for being so responsive to the reviews. I think this underscore notation is going to be confusing.
Okay.
So if you could just like
Suggestions?
use different words or something, I think that would be better.
So
Just
what would be your suggestion? So
like the ACP is expected to do X
Okay.
or something like that. Yeah.
okay, all right. Yep. We'll take that into account. Yeah. Anything formal would be nice, but yeah, if we can't find something good formal, then let's go with that. So intent. We have the intent to define intent. That was our intent given to us by NMRG. So I have a lot of issues with intent, but I think at this point in time, our overall strategy, and you'll see that also in what we've written into the candidate charter, is to bug NMRG with that. And we had at 102 an offsite meeting in NMRG where I brought up the point about there was a really great collaboration in NMRG resulting in ANIMA being created and everything, but we really didn't make any progress with intent. So please, dear NMRG, take care of that first before we're looking back into intent. And so that's effectively what on the technical side is happening. What I did elaborate more in A8 about intent is about the one critical technical issue that we may run into in, for example, upcoming work items like information distribution, where information might be another word for whatever intent ends up being. And that's the problem of circular dependency, right? So if you're using the ACP to distribute information that the ACP needs to be built, you may be shooting yourself in the feet, creating security issues. So that's definitely something that we want to be very careful when we're defining through potential future work, like the information distribution is a scheme that does that. And so that's what that Appendix A8 now is focused on. And it gives one example because there is the desire to allow ACPs to be interconnected, but what are the policies for interconnection? They could be distributed through the network itself. So some part of the information distribution could really impact on saying, okay, this information distribution is always done. Then on the other side of the network, you're seeing if you can accept that information. If so, then you're acting on the information. Then you may build the ACP through. So this is just hinting at it, but primarily it's a problem statement for future work around information distribution that leverages the ACP. So then what was also brought up by Alicia's or some other feedback, the dependency against the data plane. So we obviously wanted the ACP to be as bulletproof against misconfiguration, whether it's a poor operator or a stupid SDN controller or vice versa. We don't want to give them any opportunity to break the ACP, and there is pretty much only one key point left, which is that all the ACP tunnels are specified in the standard to be on top of normal data plane IPv6 link local. And that can basically and does in implementations that I've been involved with break the ACP if the data plane IPv6 link local is misconfigured. And the fact that this is possible was still part of the conscious choice of trying to find the lowest common denominator for how to carry ACP channels that we know will work across all possible platforms and router types. Right, and that basically any improvements that can be done in the future would rather be done as simple, add-on documents that would just specify additional link local procedures. And as I was outlining in this section, also some of them, there are even, implementation on how you can do this in a way that cannot break, where the data plane cannot break it.
Sorry, oh, Dan.
On the iconography. So you've got like the passport control guy and a baby buggy for the same thing. That those don't.
Which do you like?
The passport control guy.
Yeah, okay. That's good. All right, so that's nice to know. I actually do appreciate that. So I thought about, how to do that. All right, so I'm here now to talk about the constrained voucher document. Or the URL at the bottom, it's wrong. Next slide, please. Just to recap, this takes RFC 8366, which defines some lovely yang. It serializes it with to CBOR using a SID process, which is defined in the core working group. We can sign it with CMS, just like the regular Brewski vouchers. We can sign it with COSI. At first, I couldn't understand why you would want a constrained voucher that you then signed with a very big CMS object, and it turns out that there's some good reasons to do this, and one of them is just because they want UDP rather than TCP. Next slide, please, actually. So one of the questions is in this document is essentially finished. It models vouchers in COAP. But there's a desire from a lot of people then say, okay, but now I really want to use COAP to do Brewski operations. And so the question is, does that text belong in this document? Right now, the text lives in a 6-dish document because that's the working group that originally, 4 years ago, wanted to actually do this. And so text has been leaving that document over the years and going into other documents. And so the question is, really, should the constrained voucher document really be the constrained Brewski document? And that's not what we originally set out to do, but there's several people that seem to be pushing that to happen. And I don't have a basis on which to say no or yes or something like this. So I really want some feedback from this, and not just a little pink box. We're actually having a side meeting on enrollment period at 6 p.m. tomorrow. So come if you care about that or if you have an opinion about this. So next slide. I think that's a question, yeah. We still have some issues with SID allocation. These are political layer 8, layer 9 issues. They're not what are the SID values so much as what is the process at the IETF by which we're going to manage these things. We have a couple of different proposals that we need to talk to the core working group, which is, by the way, also in this time slot, I think it is. And so we got the early allocation for the co-op content format numbers. There is, in fact, a Fair Hair Alliance interop plan for the end of November, which we'll need to use these numbers. And I guess we'll use private allocations if we have to. So that's pretty good because we basically have 4, potentially 5 companies implementations that are going to be interoperating all of this, within weeks. I also have some things I could say that I just wrote about for co-op EST. There's some other people that are just doing EST for that, and we've been interop weekly meetings. Next slide, please. I think that's it. That's the last slide, yeah. Questions. So in particular, the question of whether or not the operational Brewski part belongs in this constrained voucher document. If so, then the document becomes potentially much larger. If not, then we either need another document somewhere else or some other decision. And I personally would rather just have small documents that sail through quickly, although that never seems to really be the truth. Questions? No? I'm done. Shall I go find the NOC? Do you want me to go talk to the NOC about our problems?
I mean, give us comments personal.
It's back? Is that because we opened the door?
Of course. That was the reason.
It's you. No? Okay, so it's back. To me, to mine. It's you. Yeah. Good, yeah. Oh, no, that work. Talk to me.
Next slide. Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, all the initial Charter Round 1 documents that we started out originally with are at least in IESG review. We did adopt a few smaller items from it afterwards, but so we've already been discussing since the beginning of the year about the recharter process. In IETF 102, we started to write up a proposed charter and started to circulate that on the working group list. And so we need more active discussion, like, for example, here right now, to progress that and hopefully conclude. We had one round of review and feedback with our area director, Ignas, people who don't know him. And I think he just opened the the official thing in Data Tracker about rechartering. I'm not actually sure what the detailed process there is, but I think Ignas could explain that to us. So the main points of the first version was to reiterate on what the relevance of the human involvement in these autonomic networks is, because we had this terminology of professionally operated networks in the current Charter Round 1 to distinguish us primarily from HomeNet, which is really meant to be completely autonomous, and like nobody has any idea why anything is going on in the network, and that's a good thing. And so the goal of ANIMA is obviously somewhat different and more really focused on supporting the network to provide a lot of specific things that the operators want to get from the network and policies and so on. And so that there is text to try to make that clearer. Also, the relevance of the NOC. NOC is really just the most commonly understood example for some decentralized or centralized external entity that from which a lot of control is being exercised, whether that is involving a lot of human action or future automation. So hopefully we're capturing that correctly. There was the confusion about OEM, what OEM means. Traditionally for 20 years in the network management area, there's one understanding, and then people in the routing working group started to introduce terms like IOM that means something completely different. So the proposed charter now says OAMP, which is a newer term from the network management side of things that hopefully refuses that confusion of the overloaded TLA. And then as far as dates and deliverables, so, and you'll see that at the end of the proposed charter text, that what we're trying to do is to make sure that by default, things that we're accepting in the working group have enough resources to be worked on with respect to the authors, so that we, don't want to say, hey, there are all these wonderful things we could do right now, but sorry, these 3 things are coming from the same authors. Maybe we should rather serialize them. So really doing time management, and then also seeing that by default we're looking into things that could be finished faster. So I think we all went through a learning exercise with Charter Round 1, and the documents that we started out doing were ultimately, very big grasp, Brusky and ACP specifically. So if we could do it again, we'd probably have cut them up into smaller pieces that we could have better serialized. But obviously, in a round 1, that's always very difficult to achieve. Hopefully, we can do a better job on that in a round 2. So with that being said, next slide. So we do have, a long list of drafts that have been presented over the time. On the right-hand side, you can see, and I'm not going to go through them, just to see that we have a lot of interesting potential work pending, and that isn't even including, all the things that I, for example, would like to work on, just finishing up round 1, or maybe others as well that haven't been posted. And so that's exactly why I think we wanted to make sure that we're not upfront, looking into specific drafts to adopt, but rather making sure that the charter itself reflects the criteria that we want to agree on to accept working documents for a working group. And so, high level, and that's what the charter text hopefully specifies, right? What is best done in ANIMA instead of a different working group, right? So standard policy, if somebody else can do it too, why should we? What can effectively be done in terms of where we, as I said, from the time management, the resources that we have, can do it. And then also, that relate to the charter round 1, because what we have done with the ANI is a framework that obviously we want to leverage in the future work, and we have undefined components like the ASA, the autonomic functions. So those are obviously key pieces that we would like to have follow-up work done, because they're so far from Charter 1 barred. Next slide. Okay, so here's the next slides, really the read down of the text of the charter, and it would really be great if we can have comments on these, any suggestions for improvements or so that we're making sure that we're really taking the feedback from the working group into account. And I'll try to ask that at the end of each slide. So let me go through this. So the Autonomic Networking Integrated Model and Approach Working Group is developing specifications and supporting documentation for interoperable products, implementations, operational procedures for automated network management and control mechanisms for networks that are developed, built, and operated by professional personnel. So actually that should have been read. These professional networks, that's what I've replaced there with, developed, built, and operated by professional personnel. And I think especially when we get to the ASAs, the autonomic functions, I think what we're trying to achieve is how can, network software be built in a more modular, faster, and easier fashion through the concept of, modular ASAs that are combined to autonomic functions, as opposed to what we have right now, which is, in most of network equipment today, humongous tens of millions of lines of code, monolithic code, which totally is the opposite to what we know to be successful in software and data centers, for example. So that's why, to me, I think specifically the aspect of, what can we do for the building of better network automation software should also be a key part, and not only the operational part. Once the software is there, how can it easily be used, hopefully with the least amount of work? I think that's a lot clearer, a lot better understood, and much less controversial. So please, if you think we shouldn't support the developers too, stand up and chime in here. But I think that would really be a great outcome of things we would do with autonomic function and autonomic service agents. The vision of ANIMA is the fully self-chop network, configure, heal, optimize, protect. The strategy is the incremental introduction of components to make it easier to evolve existing and next generation networks into that direction, including the evolution of DevOps for networks through the support of more agile and modular developed and deployed networking automation. So that's basically the restatement of exactly that, development supportive view of the architecture. The basis for ongoing work in ANIMA are the framework and components developed by ANIMA so far, documented in draft IETF ANIMA reference model. Standalone work not relating to any component of this framework is welcome for review, but working group adoption of such work will be done through explicit rechartering. So this is this is the most narrowing part of the charter. So please, if you're very interested in work where you don't think you can relate it to the reference model that we've written, please stand up and chime in, because I think that would be very crucial to understand. The hope was that obviously the things that we have in the reference model do very well lay out the scope of work items. The components developed so far in this ANIMA framework constitute the autonomic networking infrastructure, consisting of the autonomic control plane, bootstrap over secure key infrastructure, including the concept of vouchers and generic autonomic signaling protocol grasp. Any comments here? No, this is there are more and more slides on the chart. They're getting more and more specific. So,
Michael Richardson, I don't understand the part about DevOps. I've read it 3 times now, and I have no idea what that sentence means. So go on to your other slides, and maybe I'll learn. But
no,
I have a lot of problems with that. I don't know what it means to our charter. I don't know why DevOps isn't that we're there.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's wrong. But I don't even know what, even if I just cross that out, I still don't know what the sentence actually means from a working group point of view, right?
I think that's a fair statement. I mean, I think that, somebody without operational experience would come in and say, I don't know what operations mean. So maybe I'm not sure if it's a good place to try to figure out what it means in the charter, but yeah.
Well, give me an example of what you're trying to enable the working group to do.
I think primarily, for example, on the ASA, to think about what is necessary to ensure that these ASAs can ultimately be deployed incrementally into a running system, instead of just the monolithic update of complete, network operating software that it comes with 100 ASAs or so, but that you can't modularly upgrade, right? So that,
Well, it sounds like a implementation requirement, not a protocol requirement.
Well, that's an interesting question,
Yeah.
right? So
it sounds like you're trying to tell vendors how to build their system rather than how to send the bytes over the wire, which is really our major concern. Right?
Well, let's say this. So there is an interesting evolution in the IETF, and it's one of my rants, right? That in the past, anything that happens within the box stays within the box, and the IETF doesn't care. And any APIs between software components in a box that should possibly come from different vendors and interoperate was still considered to be just informational because it was in the box. The best examples were any specifications of APIs like in the transport layer. But recently, in TAPS, the API specifications have been put onto the standards track. So hopefully this is a good evolution. And this is effectively what I was thinking about, right? If we're building ASAs, can we get standards for the APIs between software components that we would like to come from different vendors, and they are being, by the operator put together into the same devices?
Alex Huawei. One comment there also on this. I find this also a little bit confusing, and actually maybe also in similar terms. To me, it seems to be a little bit a contradiction in terms. First, basically, ANIMA talks about the self-chop network, basically self-configuring, self-healing, self-optimizing, self-protection. Basically, if that vision is fulfilled, the question is what role actually is there for DevOps to play? So
well,
that seems to be
self-developing. That would be really great. But I don't think we want to target that.
But is it the question, does it concern the self-chop functions or the development of those functions? I think so. There are some inherent...
The development of those functions, yes. The DevOps that I said is really about, building autonomic functions and allowing them to be really modularly introduced into the network. And maybe that's a better, explanation than saying DevOps, right? So maybe that's not yet a well enough understood buzzword to quantify.
No, I think that DevOps is understood as a word, but I think what I'm having a little bit trouble with is that there are things, basically 2 layers of abstraction. One thing is the function, then the other aspect is the development of those functions.
So
they want to include both here. I don't know. I find that a little confusing.
Could you help to propose better text? That would be great.
Okay. I'll think about it. Yeah.
I know there is a nasty guy sitting next to you that will remind you.
All right.
Thank you.
Right, Ignas Bogdanas. Otoilas, you mostly answered my comment. DevOps is a fancy marketing hand-waving term, which pretty much means nothing. So...
less so than operations?
Those are orthogonal things. So trying to trying to describe how things should be used versus how things should be developed, those are two different things. And I think the focus of the charter should be on how to develop the things, or basically the specification, not necessarily how they are used in all possible cases.
Right.
So-
No, I've taken the point that instead of writing just the keyword DevOps, just the fact of being able to support, modularly developed and deployed software should be within the scope, right? So maybe that's around at least that's what I tried to
Yes.
achieve with this. And, I wasn't sure how well DevOps was understood to enable that, but it seems definitely not.
Will, from Huawei. So I find that the scope here, the configuration, health optimization, protection is actually a very, very wide, ambitious version. And to me, that the health and optimize, maybe these two terms have some overlap. I'm not sure whether, because if you say health, the network is health, or the network is protected, or it's optimized. Sometimes these are similar concept actually. So I'm not sure how would you define clearly this chop? What is the concept of the clear scope of this chop?
I think that terminology is, in network management established over decades, and I would refer to, folks that understand that better than I do to jump in with, whether this is also just too much marketing term or,
Yeah.
technically sufficient.
Yeah, so I would suggest that if we put this in the charter, we may use those clearly defined terms instead of those like marketing words.
Yeah, I mean, we have certain size limitations of the charter and things. So I'm just wondering what the most, shorthand, precise way is to write this.
Just to mention and answer to Will, Laurent Chavalia, there are existing definitions for the chopped stuff, and I mean, we can have something very precise and concise, so it's not an issue. Protection is essentially towards the security aspect. Optimize is towards the performance of the running system, and healing is towards the when something wrong is going on. So yeah, some overlap, but it's pretty well defined in a lot of literature.
So just to clarify, so you mean health is the, some kind of the internal process, and the protection is out. You protect something outside. Is that true? From different directions.
Yeah, not necessarily from internally or externally point of view, but here is something that the system is not behaving at its nominal point. There is something wrong with the expected behavior of the system from performance point of view. Protection is essentially a term used in the literature towards the security aspect, how to protect the system from attacks, whatever is related to security issues, which is two different things. One is restoration protection in terms of making the system come back to a normal behavior, and the protection is more the security aspect.
I could agree with that if you say that the health is something, because when the network have some issues, it mainly comes two reasons. One is that some software or hardware mistake, and the other one is that we got attacked by some outside, attactions. So that if you define that too clearly, I think that's fine with my side.
Okay, next slide. Okay. There are known gaps, so this was basically the overview, and then basically all these following slides are about different sub-areas of what was covered in the previous slide. So there are known gaps in the framework, including defining the domain boundaries, membership of a domain, structure, lifecycle, roles, authorization, coordinating of autonomic service agents, integration with network operation centers and reporting mechanisms, information distribution within an autonomic network, interaction with Yang-based management systems, additional generic use cases such as resource management or SLA assurance. Anima will work on these gaps and other aspects of the existing frameworks, more detailed below, but exception, there are long-term issues that are not yet well understood to consider specific solutions for intent and tie into machine learning and other AI techniques. Anima will not work on these issues without explicit rechartering. Right, there's always a lot of research interest and so on, but we'll really have a hard time, and we've seen that in the past 2 years, to bring down these pieces to something that somebody could actually implement and or operate.
Next slide. ANIMA will continue to work on fixes, extensions, variations, and operational or implementation detailing of the overall ANI and its component. Examples of such work is not limited to, but includes ANI OAMP interfaces. This is this term, operations, administration, management, provisioning, for example, Yang models for the ANI. So that obviously is one of those, most short-term, missing pieces of what we've done in Charter Round 1, and I've got something, half worked lying out for a long time. Structuring ANI, virtualization, compounding, right? There were always these questions. Okay, I got one ANI, how do I connect another one? Variations of voucher formats, that work is already going on, as we saw from presentations. Brewski Bootstrap protocol aspects, different proxies, extensions for wireless, that work also is seeing a lot of interest. And then common grasp extensions for multiple use cases, bulk transfer, DNS SD compatible grasp objectives. So this slide is really about, the most immediate things to leverage and extend missing pieces in what we've done in Charter Round 1. Any, questions, suggestions on this one? Here. Or the last slide, sorry, I just...
Wolfgang Beck, Deutsche Telekom. When you talk about virtualization, are you thinking of multi-tenancy as well?
Yeah, I think that that could be in scope. I was primarily thinking with virtualization about what happens with ANI or so if I want to build virtual routers, but yeah, multi-tenancy would be potentially another variation of that. So, but yeah, I think that
because operators are starting or even are sharing hardware with other operators, forced by regulation or just by commercial agreement. So
right. Yeah, but and that's exactly good to know the different use cases to collect them, because I think there definitely is a difference between a management plane that you need to have for something virtual versus the management plane you need to have for physical equipment, and so that was just basically the starting point to think about it, and so that multi-tenancy of actual hardware is definitely part of that. Next slide. So now autonomic functions, just we're explaining for the Charter the term, right? It's the ANIMA framework term for distributed functions leveraging the ANI, preferably automatically managed. The ANIMA working group will consider work items to specify individual autonomic functions, including but not limited to standardized autonomic function use cases such as auto-discovery of decentralized services, such as those in the network operation centers, autonomic slice management, and autonomic SLA management. Work on ANI use case and autonomic functions must be detailed and complete enough, and this, by the way, is a summary that is meant to apply to all the previous points made, not only to the ones here on this slide. Must be detailed and complete enough to support implementation of solutions that can be deployed and operated. Standards track is preferred, but more exploratory, experimental, or informational work proposals will be accepted based on the expected operational benefits.
Right, Ignas Bagdonas. Two comments on this. Slicing. The IETF formally does not work on slicing as such. Work on slicing management seems a bit strange in the Charter. So on another hand, this seems to be a really very specific work item compared to the rest of the Charter, which is generic enough to accommodate, say, broader scope of the work. So from without an AD hat, as a working group, interested working group member, I would vote for removing slicing completely from the Charter. It just does not fit here.
And, I don't even know what any official understanding in the IETF of slicing is, except for that we haven't been able to figure out what it means. But, to me, it could exactly be something similar to the multi-tenancy of hardware, right? So maybe other terminology like multi-tenancy would be better terms to express something. But so, I think as long as it's fine, just by removing it doesn't mean that we wouldn't be able to work on something that meets exactly what's on the bottom, which is we figure out that the proposed work can be implemented, is beneficial, and can be deployed and operated, right?
Precisely, to have the sufficiently broad chatter which allows for experiments to come in,
Right.
but not necessarily listing them out with the particular names.
Right.
On the network slicing in general in IETF, the data plane work is happening in the routing area, and that's called VPN+. From a manageability point of view, it's just another, say, instance of the data plane plus control plane. We already have all the mechanisms which are needed for that, so no additional work is strictly needed.
Well,
for that.
the multi-tenancy, I mean, I'm not sure if the Yang models have better separation, but I do vividly remember how,
There's
separating
network
out,
instance and logical network entity models which fit into that, and they're precisely done for this use case. Another comment on the experiments, and basically, what is the criteria for the exit from experiment? If we are talking about the experimental track documents, so what is the success and exit criteria for the experiments? This should not be listed in the chat as such, but this is one area that needs to be thought of. So if we're doing experiment, when that experiment is over, and what does it mean? It succeeded, failed, or what?
So what would be your text proposal for this paragraph?
To add something about the criteria of experimentation. This is an IETF working group. This is not IETF, which does, say, experiments or research. So something tangible needs to come out of this, which results in a running code and actual deployment experiences. If that cannot result in running code, I would probably have a question whether this working group should work on that.
No, agreed, but isn't that what the red sentence already said?
In that case, we maybe just remove
the red sentence
the
says,
words.
so go ahead.
I mean, it seems for me, maybe simply remove the words experimental can solve the issue, but still, we are allowed people to propose something new, but towards, running code, towards, to be standardized.
Yes, I'm not disagreeing with that. And my comment is about the words experimental information, because those match the document tracks. And experimental document is, well, basically, the question with experimental document is it defines an experiment. It's kind of a continuing process. What's the exit criteria out of that? To answer in short, I do not have a text to propose right now, but I will think about this.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, I mean, I'm just looking at the experimental stuff I've seen in the recent past, and I thought in the IETF we do fairly well understand that there is more risk involved, and we don't recommend it for anybody to adopt. But for people who want to innovate, get involved in the experiment, and obviously, by default, the goal of experimental stuff in the IETF is that we figure out all the things missing to make it standards. So I thought that was implied, but I'm not sure if that's not implied, then maybe that's something we should be.
Right.
Michael?
Michael Richardson. So if I understand this slide correctly, what your premise here is that we have built a good foundation. We know how to pour concrete. And your proposal is now to open it up to, in my metaphor, to a variety of different house shapes on top of the concrete foundation that we have. And some of them will be crazy experimental things, and some of them will be less. But that's the idea, that we now have a common base in our process, and now we can go upwards in the kind of concept. That's what you're thinking about right now.
Yeah, and I think, especially when we come to autonomic functions, do things automatically, right? With distributed agents, I can see a lot more, resistance from people with established management practice, so that I think it would be a lot harder for any such, automated management to get enough, support from operators to go to standards track. They'd rather want to see, it being given the label of experimental, so that people who are, courageous enough to put these things into the running wild collect experience and then come back and revisit the, result of that experience. And I think that would be similar to what I think you were saying too, right?
I think that this is great. This is really important stuff to do. And maybe it's okay that it's in our charter now. But I would be surprised if we have the concern I have is we put a bunch of stuff like this in our charter. We have very few people show up to do any work. And then we think the working group is moribund and dead and should be closed, right? When what's really happening is that our belief that the foundation is well built was not yet correct, and that anyone in an implementation point of view, maybe the protocols are perfect or maybe they're not, but that actually the people that were out trying to do innovative house construction and design discovered that their foundation was mispoured and they have to rebuild that part. And so there's going to be actually a fair bit of delay, I would say, until people actually feel confident that the stuff underneath them is good. And so I don't know how to write that into a charter because it's more of a industry-wide kind of problem. But I just want to say I think that's something we should just be aware of, that, and maybe we don't want to. An option is to just defer this text to another rechartering, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, let's say this. I think, let me give you a positive and a negative on this. So the negative is that I would agree that the likelihood that, from the classical constituencies of, IETF participants that are very centric to, current network operations, I would agree that the likelihood of getting a lot of cool, autonomic functionality is rather small. We had, one or two interesting presentations in the past from customers like from Comcast about autonomic fault management and so on. But on the other hand, we also have the DINRG, IRTF research group that has started to look into a lot of interesting decentralized automated infrastructure things. And I just wanted to make sure that when they actually ever get to a point where they can define things that need to interoperate and that can be implemented and deployed for experiments, that we as ANIMA are open to them, to define these things as autonomic function, as autonomic service agents.
I guess you are participating in that research group?
Well, so far I've just, presented to them that,
I just would hate for them to think that they have to go invent things because they were ignorant of what we've already produced.
Oh, no, I presented ANIMA, also the history with, NMRG and ANIMA, but I think, the collaboration between DINRG and ANIMA would be, slightly different, but hopefully, there could be a success story made out of that as well. But I have a hard time seeing that anything from the research side coming up, being implemented, deployed, would be more than experimental first. So that was basically, and that I think is actually the opportunity to really get interesting autonomic functions that go beyond, basic level stuff. Next slide.
I also have one clarification question. I'm Tasang Che from I3. Regarding on the autonomic slice management, do you mean autonomic slice management as a management of network slices of any networks? Or do you mean that the virtualization of ANI, the ANIMA network infrastructure, and then managing the fashion of managing of that ANI multiple slice instances is autonomic? If it is the latter, I mean, if it is former, I think the person who mentioned that, I think I know that there is some efforts, a previous effort to bring the slice management in general into the IETF, but I heard that there are some issues with that. But if it is the latter, I think that's still within the scope of ANIMA working group, because this is, as you said, making multi-tenancy aspect of ANIMA infrastructure as multiple slices. So,
yeah,
just.
So I think that would be kind of maybe second or third voice that maybe we should think about rewording that in terms of, what do we need to do in the ANI infrastructure? What could or should we do if we have a multi-tenancy infrastructure?
So to respond to your comment, physical network, logical network, virtual network, sliced network, any other network is a network. Physical node, virtual node is just a node, and the core management aspects of that and core operational aspects of that are exactly the same. The differences are on, say, platform-specific aspects, implementation aspects, and so on. So they are not strictly exactly the same elements, but from a manageability point of view, and if we are talking about the service management, it's the same. So trying to distinguish one particular flavor of networks, so to say, does not seem to be right.
Well, I would say in general, I see one big difference, which is that if I'm building any form of virtualized slice, however you call it, network on top of an underlying network that is already running and working, I'm very often going to do the management of that virtualized network through the underlying network. So when we started out with Anima, we basically were primarily focusing physical networks where there is nothing underlying, right? So that was, if you remember, kind of the out-of-band physical management that we wanted to try to get rid of. That is basically that underlying pre-existing network through which we can manage the new network. So we're trying to get rid of that. And I think the question of whether or how we actually want to get rid of that does change when we go higher up in the stack of virtual networks.
I do agree with you to a level, or in a sense, I don't disagree with you on this. Just that from my side, I think that trying to define really different approaches to different classes of networks is not necessarily right. Yes, there are subtle differences, they need to be accounted for, but overall, if we are talking, if you take any practical router today, it's a virtual router, even if it looks as a physical box. Mm-hmm. The way how that runs internally is very different than it was just a normal hardware platform. And that's just the reality.
Right. And maybe that is as much as there is out of it, which is an informational document or so that in the end says just because you're virtualizing your routers, there still are a lot of operational benefits to have the same manageability infrastructure like for a physical infrastructure.
Exactly.
Because right now, I think the perception of people is if I have an underlying network, I can manage my virtual network on top of it in the same way, which may actually not be true because the ownership may be different, right? So I think, but simply looking into that problem space and figuring out what even to do, right? And as you said, maybe it's nothing more than informational, there is nothing new, could be perfectly great outcome, but I don't think we have, done that analysis and come to conclusions.
Yes, definitely looking, but not necessarily precisely specifying into what to look. It should be generic enough. So again, I will repeat that putting in the name of network slicing there seems not to be a right approach.
No, I mean, that's fine. I think the DevOps and slice seem to be, too much marketing with too few people agreeing on what exactly they mean. So that's for sure that those
Precisely.
go. Yeah. Next slide. All right, autonomic software agents are the Anima framework component representing software modules that implement autonomic functions. The Anima working group will consider work items relating to ASA and other aspects of autonomic functions that are applicable, independent of specific autonomic functions and its ASA. These work items include, but are not limited to, design implementary guidelines for ASA, ASA lifecycle management, that is also where kind of this modular deployable would come in, ASA coordination dependency resolution, that's basically, what Laurent has documents over, and acceptance of work items will be based on the perceived value to implementers and or operators. Status of work can be standards tracked if the work includes normative statements about node external behavior, such as requirements for Yang interfaces on ASA. Exploratory work in this area can be experimental. Work describing node internal only behavior will be information. This actually is what I wrote before I figured out that recently, I think as late as 1 or 2 months ago, they started to put tabs, APIs onto standards track. So I'm still trying to figure out what the official evolution in the IETF policy for standardizing internal interfaces is. So, do you have any ADs, ex-ADs here in the room? Any idea what kind of the policies now are? I was always working from the principle, which I think has been there for decades, that internal interfaces aren't standardized. They must be informational. That's basically why I wrote this text. But now I was very positively surprised that that seems not to be the case anymore with at least my interpretation of what happens in tabs.
Currently, I came from Korea in the academia. In a point of the academic point of view, is we have think about the artificial intelligence technology is applied to some autonomous network environment, and what is there any possibility to insert to some of the artificial intelligence, some machine learning algorithm, putting into some help to the automatic function?
So we had in the beginning slide some exclusion about AI just because we're very afraid that we hadn't seen any work being proposed here around AI to be specific enough that we would know how to defend it as an IETF working item with respect. You do know what you can implement. And so we said this should be done to rechartering. Now, this is a big rechartering, but it doesn't mean that if we figure out that there is something about AI that is really grounded enough that it can be implemented and deployed, that can't be added through the charter through a very simple rechartering steps. Right? We've seen that difference between big recharters and small individual item recharters that exists. But at this point in time, I think the first step about those things is individual submissions and then verifying how much is this actually something where interoperable implementation of standards is something that can be achieved by the work. If that can be achieved and the working group likes this, then we'll basically do a separate recharter for that. Benoit.
Benoit Claes. So let me share my feedback on the charter so far. Maybe it won't be easily actionable, but we are on the 5th or 6th slide on the charter already, and I've seen every single buzzword that will make sure that people will come to this working group to do something. There is AI, there is machine learning, there is virtualization, there is self, whatever. There is life cycle management. So basically, we've got two types of charters. The one that are inclusive, where you say, this is what we're working on, and we could be accepting more work, or the one that are very precise. And right now we've got a mix of the two. And I'm wondering if this is really the right way. It's perfectly fine to have the vision of ANIMA is. There is one line. It's the vision. You have to explain everything. That's where you want to go. And there you have 6 slides of all different possible things that you want to work on, but also include. And I'm wondering if it's the right way in the end. Maybe you want to agree on this is what we're going to deliver, with a vision in the end for future chartering. Sorry. So I'm afraid that you're going to discuss this charter and whether the work is in charter for every single new proposed work. We're going to discuss that a lot in the future working group meetings.
So one of the reasons why we put text in there that's more explanatory is because we've seen a lot of work being brought to the working group, and we were trying to basically tunnel that in the future more into things that we think do produce actionable and usable results, right? And that actually meant to repeat the individual components that we have in the ANIMA vision, because I think that doing it through a charter, yes, it is some replication of what we've done in the reference model, but it should hopefully help a lot more to the open-ended invitation that we have for people to come present work, but hopefully in the future making that, because in the first charter we didn't have this more detailed specification, right? So this is new. There are a lot of people that I think could bring in interesting work, but very often it's too high level, too abstract, not grounded enough, not relating to what we've done in ANIMA before. So so this is a little bit an attempt to set the scope for people who are new to the work and can actually much more leverage the Charter 2.0 to figure out what they would need to do to, well, work with an ANIMA.
Okay. Actually, I'm I'm intended to agree with BY. You know, this new charter text looks so long to including everything, also the detailed explanations. Maybe what we could do is, you know, try to short the charter text, but put those detailed, you know, explanation into a, you know, working group document, which is not going to be published as RFC, but as a, you know, document, you know, working document for the working group to say what's, you know, could be in charter with more detail in that document. How's that?
Well, writing a document that is part of the charter or not, maybe it's not the right way, but having something concise. You've got a couple of sentences there that could be discussed, like DevOps. What do you mean? So you must have requirements be matchable. Okay, end of story. Describing things about experimental that might be standard track, but potentially experimental. Typically what you do in the past is that if you work on this work item, while in the charter it says, not the charter, the milestone, this one is standard track, experimental. It could be revisited, right? But more guidelines on what you want to do might be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, each of these slides has basically one of the areas, right? But if we were stripping down the details, that's fine. If that is better needed, I think then the problem is what I think Shen and I are saying is that we have a lot of people that, you know, come in with hopefully fresh ideas and useful work perspectives, but we're repeating over and over the aspects of how do these things need to be shaped to make sense for an IETF working group. Maybe it is easier to do that in a, you know, more explanatory document than in a charter. So
hearing all of this, Ignas Bogdanas, hearing all of this, I have kind of a worrying feeling that the scope might be really too broad. Yes, new work should be coming into the IETF. Does that mean that it needs to come to ANIMA versus, say, potentially new working group, which focuses on a fragment of what is being discussed here? I don't have an answer right now, but I don't believe that ANIMA should be basically all gathering place for all new work which is somehow related to this charter. So yes, I would agree that this needs to be more precise, and probably what really needs to be is the deliverables. You probably will talk about that in the coming slides and about the timelines and the deliverables. So as the scope seems to be broad, the set of deliverables needs to be very concrete and specific.
But remember the first two slides set, I think, a rather strict scope insofar as that we're looking for our pieces that are relating to the reference model that we've built. And that reference model, I don't think that any pieces, you know, that I can imagine within that reference model would be too broad, right? So I mean, just because we list these different components on each slide more explanatory doesn't make it actually wider. It just provides more details, right? So I would very much question, you know, what are your criteria for broad? I don't think the number of slides can be that, because as Benoit said, we can, you know, make this arbitrary short or arbitrary long. The length was primarily for educational purposes.
Definitely not the number of slides, but at least the list of documents that you have there is already quite large. So if we are talking about 4 meeting cycle intervals, right, the question is, can those documents actually be progressed to a tangible result during the 4 meeting cycles? And I'm not expecting an answer for you, I'm just commenting.
But I think that would basically be the process, which, you know, is the question on the last slides, that we manage documents as individual contributions up to the point where the working group majority thinks, you know, where we have rough consensus that from now on the working group work on this document can basically be finished in that amount of time, or that people think this is so important that even if this takes 2 or 3 years, we would like to do it, right? But at that point in time, the suggestion was to get explicit permission from the ADs then to do it, right?
Okay.
That was the point, right? Yeah.
Jefferson Aubrey. Shank, just a clarification. When you mentioned another document to describe the work that we done in the working group, you know, I got confused because at the end of the day, what defines what will be presented in the meeting is the charter. So because I don't know what this can help us at the end.
Forget that.
Next slide.
The last one.
Yep, this is the last slide. So ANIMA will coordinate with other IETF working groups and IRTF research groups and only accept work that is not better suited for other working groups. So that part I mentioned initially, but it's fairly late in the slide here. Sorry, in the charter, but I think it's the right place here. Examples include variation of components of the ANI in a solution owned by other working groups, such as 6-TiSCH for specific variations of Brewski mechanisms. Details of ANI components owned by other working groups, for example, role for the ACP using Ripple protocol extension or modifications. NMRG for definition of intent terminology and taxonomy, and DINRG for definition of aspects of distributed autonomic functions not well enough understood to allow adoption by ANIMA, right? So working group items accepted under this charter will be tracked through milestones and have by default to be brought into working group last call in not more than 4 IETF cycles. Work items expected to take longer time are subject to AD approval, right? So, we can cut out a lot, explanations from the middle of the document, just listing, without explaining and without giving examples. And then, for example, having, as Shane said, just informational document explaining a little bit better to newcomers what that could mean in detail. And then we have a fairly terse charter. But yeah, this is new to us, so please help in getting the charter outline that you prefer. I mean, Benoit, you've seen a lot more than Ignace, I think, over the years, what work was being brought into ANIMA working group, and that's, I think, what we're trying to manage.
So since you mentioned my name, Benoit Kless, let me go back to Mike. So maybe what I would do, right? But okay, it's just an advice because I've not been following ANIMA and the charter discussion, but typically there is a mix of many things in the charter. There is a mix of the process, right? The last paragraph is about tracking through milestone and 4 IETF cycle, and then it's AD approval. But it's too late, for example, because you're going to say, okay, we accept this document. And then after 4 IETF meetings, we're going to say, well, no, it's too long. You go back to AD approval. That doesn't work. Then you explain also from a process point of view that it should be on a track. It could be experimental. It's a process stuff, right?
Okay.
So this, in my mind, should be removed. Then there is like all different use cases. Then there is the vision. Then there is all the keywords. I would simplify this a lot. That's maybe what I would do. I was reading the charter and I was thinking that I could present like 10 new drafts here and pretend that they fit into the charter. In one of the previous slides, I was reading about operator interest. So if you could go back. Yeah. Acceptance of work items will be based on the perceived value to implementers and operators. Sure. It's like normal procedure. Why do you need to have that? I'm going to come with the first slide telling I've got some operator interest and I'm about to implement it. I fit the charter. It's about the life cycle of an agent. Okay, I'm in charter. So
maybe it's not the right word, right? But I was really thinking when writing this about the fact when things are at the architectural level, and the question is, can we bring it down to the level where it actually results in running code, right?
Right. Next sentence. Status of work can be on a track if the work includes a normative statement about normal external interfaces.
Well, I mean, this was just, that's fine. You're right. That is just
why
maybe just a
next sentence. Exploratory work in this area can be experimental. Sure. So what? It could always be. I mean, if you're not sure, speak to your AD. right? Work describing non-internal only behavior will be informational, right? Again, it could be part of the milestone initially, and whenever document evolves, it could be changed to some track
No,
if
this is
necessary.
fine.
There are so many things in the charter that everybody will be happy, but in the end, it's very difficult to know where you're going with your deliverables.
Well, okay, but wait a second, those are two different things, right? The first thing is what is explanatory that isn't needed to be put into the charter, right? So that's certainly very well taken. There is probably a lot more that we need to explain to, participants in the working group than what, the IETF expects us to put in the charter. Point well taken, right? So, and we can work through that. We'll just remove these things and then we'll hear back from, Ignas which points we should put back there. The other part is about the broadness of scope, right? And I think that basically is something where we try to be much more precise in constraining this into implementable and related to the ANIMA reference model and the components that we want to do, and excluding the components we don't want to do, right? So if you have any more constraints that you think we should do, that's fine, right? Just because we have many examples does obviously not mean that all of these will be, have good proposals for work on them. And so from that perspective, it's equally fine to remove all the examples of the document and also move them out to an informational document, right? But I think the primary question still is, what is the minimum necessary definition of the scope? And if you have, opinions about how to do that different or better, then we've tried to do it here. I very much welcome that.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Yeah, we have a very good discussing our charter text today. Actually, take much longer than we thought. So we have only 20 minutes left, and we have 6 or 7 presentations. So I have to cut it off, and I prefer to give time to those who never, presented in our working group. So can we have the trust network from T-Star?
Yeah, this is Taesang Choi from IETF. Actually, this is a update from the last July meeting, 102, on trust networking and procedures for autonomy networking. Could you go to the next slide? Yeah, during that mature meeting, I got 2 comments. One is on the elaborating more on differences between our proposed trust autonomic domain and ANIMA security framework. And the second comment was on providing implementation experience of TAD based on ANIMA as a use case. So we try to update our draft, basically adding one section, section 4, which is on differences between trust networking and ANIMA security framework. And this section describes the major differences between the proposed trust autonomic domain and ANIMA security framework. And the differences, we thought about how we can describe differences. And fortunately, the Brian Carpenter from this working group proposed a draft on limited domain concept. And I think it has a very good criteria to describe the domain itself, because ANIMA is kind of one limited domain example, and our TAD is also one of them. So by using the same criteria to make a comparison between them, we thought it's good. So we describe that if you read section 4, fill in details on item by item. And those are the criteria: that domain as a whole, domain members, domain boundary, topology, technology, connection to the internet, security model, and then operation, etc. So for each criteria, we try to provide our TAD explanation and also against ANIMA security framework. Okay. And so let me go quickly, although the content itself is fairly long, but let me try to speed up. The first one criteria is domain as a whole. In our TAD, the domain can be defined by trust. So trust is a main criteria. This means that all members within a TAD trust each other so that the members can communicate with the others without any concern of security once it is accepted as a domain member. For this, TAD needs to add an additional ASA, which is a domain administrator. So its main functionality is to manage trust policies, including allocating trust level to domains and their members. And domain administrator can be extended from the current functionality of ANIMA MASA, or we can define a new ASA. Okay. And also another criteria is an individual nodes, which is domain members. And in the sense of our TAD, a node is assumed as a host that has communication functions required by the domain. Since TAD is defined under the intent of trust, a node should have identifier and authenticatable ID. And in our TAD, although it is not fully compatible with ANIMA yet, but when we define our TAD, we try to use this ID as what's called self-certifying ID, but there can be, I think we can utilize the ANIMA's local device ID as a certifiable ID. And preferably, if we can extend it, maybe we can extend it with public key information for the global uniqueness purpose. Okay. Next slide, please. So for domain boundary, for TAD, we are defining domain boundaries by using a special ISA at the node called gateway. Gateway authenticates the node and evaluates trustworthiness of the node. And if the external node is trustworthy and the communication channel between gateway and the node is safe and reliable, then we can allow those nodes outside domain to communicate safely. Okay. The next slide, please. And then from the topology point of view, the domains can also have a self-certifying ID as an ordinary node to become a member of another domain. And then domain administrator must take role of the required procedures of a parent domain, such as trust evaluation, join, and leave. Also, the gateways must take necessary translation of interactions when passing the domain boundaries. So our domain TAD can be embedded in self, and it can be defined recursively, and can also interact with a domain outside of the domain. So the administrator could perform such a role, and the gateways performs the necessary mechanism for translation and mapping, etc. Technology, in terms of technology, TAD allows any technology rather than in the current ANIMA framework. Assumes the IP technology, but on TAD, in principle, allows any technology other than IP, like MPLS or other technologies which recognize as well, as long as the domain is trust domain is properly defined. So only kind for inter-domain communication is that gateway must aware of mechanisms for both domain and then takes a role of translation. The gateway performs that. So each domain has a specific addressing scheme and identification, and then nodes and domains must be done globally unique identifier. Okay. Next slide. So connection to the internet. So basically, the gateway performs the translation between the local domain, domain-specific to the internet. In this case, we assume the internet as a global trust domain, and if by having separate individual domains to join the global internet domain, and the gateways in between can translate, performs the mapping mechanisms. So one example is in the next slide, shows that, as you can see here, we have a two trust domain, and in between we have a global internet. And from each trust domain, the nodes within the trust domain to communicate each other through this global internet. It has go through the within trust domain. It has its own private ID, and when it goes out to the global internet, it's global ID. In this case, the trust-centric domain itself is also IP-based. We assume that. Then it uses private IP as internal ID, and then when it goes out, uses the public IP. So mapping between the translation, mapping between them is done by the domain gateway. But as I said, trust domain can be technology independent. Although this example shows the private IP cases, but actually we can also have different kinds of technologies allowed. And the right side diagram shows how the mapping is done. Okay. Next slide. I think I'm consuming too much time, I guess. So security trust private model. I think we can skip this. You can read the draft. And the operation wise, and I think you can also refer to the draft. And for the second comment, we have a prototype implementation on our trust autonomic domain. This is the software module that we designed. The next slide. And very quick description on that. Next slide. And this sequence flow diagram that how its components interact each other. And then the next slide, please. And we also built a test bed to test our the components that the prototype that we built. Basically, we defined 5 different trust domain. 2 domains are embedded in another 2 domains, and we have 5 different gateways, and show some communication verification based on this test bed and the concept that I introduced.
I guess that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, we don't have time for questions. So next, Peter, for the constraint joint proxy. No, because we try to give priority. Yeah, if you could do in 5 minutes, we have 5 minutes for Michael. Yeah. Just tell me the next. Yeah. You should stay here with the mic. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I can't read it. Okay. So this is about the constraint joint proxy. It fits in the Brisky proposal, where Brisky uses EST, HTTP, and TLS. We have a constraint approach where the joint proxy is part of that. And actually it uses, what it does is that the circuit proxy, which you will find in the key infra 16 draft, will be replaced by the proxy which we define here. Next one, please. So this is in graphic way that you will see the pledge, the one which wants to be part of the network, and you have the EST server. And in between there is this circuit proxy in the HTTP TLS one. And for the constraint device, we're talking about a joint proxy. It talks link local to the pledge, and it talks global to the EST server. And it uses co-op and DTLS instead of the HTTP TLS. Yes, please. It's fast enough, I hope. Yeah. The constraints. So the transport format is that what we want to do between the pledge and the proxy is that between the joint proxy and the HT server, we want to remember what actually the link local address from the pledge was. Well, the joint proxy and the HT server talk to each other with global addresses. So what we have sent is from the pledge to the joint proxy, we have a DTLS payload. The DTLS payload is encrypted. We don't want the joint proxy to decrypt it and encrypt it again. So what we will have is the DTLS payload will be unchanged, sent over from the joint proxy to the ST server. And so what we do, we send a packet from the joint proxy to the ST server, in which we also keep the link local addresses and some other information about the pledge. And that is then sent over to the EST server. What we will use for that is a new format, which is defined recently by the core working group, is that you will have the possibilities, which was not there before, and which actually was supported by HTTP, but not by co-op, is that you can have different media formats. And in this case, what we will do is that we will define several media formats in a row in the payload, in which one of those actually specifies the address of the pledge, and in the other one you have the unmodified DTLS payload. Yes, question?
No, go ahead.
Am I clear? Okay, fine. So maybe Michael already explained it, that we have those draft relations. So there is the Brisky, which is the part on which this is all based. We have the voucher document, which is also here in ANIMA, which is well entered and which is in RFC these days. And then in ACE, we have something which is called EST Co-op S, which defines how you do EST from a pledge to the EST server. And we have an other one which is going to be discussed by Michael, which tells you about the constraint voucher, and it tells you also which are the Brisky extension to the EST functions, how that is going to be done. I won't say anything about that. The only thing I wanted to say is to make the whole thing complete and have the constraint version of the key infra 16 is this proxy. And we really hope that it will be of interest to this working group.
Yeah. Okay.
That's 4 minutes, I think.
Yeah, 4 minutes,
good,
exactly. Thank you, Peter. We'll see, discuss that in the main list.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Michael? Smart. Yeah, I believe that will be the last one for this meeting.
Hi,
Yeah.
thank you. So I spent some work doing on a secure home gateway and with Sierra. And one of the things we did not solve was how to initially hook up a phone and the gateway. Next slide. Next slide. So gateway, IoT device, it has firewalls, all things. We have an app which is shown on an iPad here, and it needs to do a secure connection to the gateway. Effectively, it needs to enroll in the domain. Next slide. Next slide. You can read those yourself. This is the Tinder of IoT devices. Next slide. And the real problem is, how do we bootstrap this trust? Next slide. So that's what we're trying to do. Next slide. Yes, this is the one I really want. Initially, I thought to myself and said, hey, you know what? I'm going to run the registrar on your smartphone, and the device that would normally be your registrar in your home is going to be the router I want to enroll. Since the smartphone has internet and the router does not yet have internet because it's not yet hooked up and needs passwords and administrative access, I'll run the registrar in there and we'll flip things around, and it will be essentially Bursky as we know it. Of course, smartphones get run over, dropped, just die. Having the root of all trust on your vulnerable device might seem like a reasonable policy from it's closest to me and most friendly to interface to, It's not so good from a resiliency point of view with real people and real stuff. So this proposal basically says, well, no, look, we're going to put the registrar on the device that's going to be the kind of infrastructure for the home. But since it doesn't have internet yet, it can't talk to the MASA. So the idea is we actually have a next slide. Yeah, there's the idea. Next slide. Next slide there. So basically we asked Brewski to have a request, a voucher request, turning what was a forward process where the pledge talks to the registrar, which talks to the MASA, and then answers, into one where the pledge talks to the registrar and then relays the request to the MASA and relays data back. I don't think in this time I can explain to you why DPP was important. DPP does something similar, and I would ideally like to leverage all of the crypto that DPP has defined. Dan's sitting over there with his hands over his face. I'd ideally like to leverage it all so that the crypto is identical, such that when we can have smartphones that have interfaces that they can speak the right management frames that DPP requires, that it's not kind of all just falls out and becomes that. Today we can't do that. And so this is essentially, DPP doesn't use MASAs and other things like this, and so there is some changes, but the idea is that the proof of who's what and the QR codes that a DPP used would be leveraged to do things. I thought a lot about using EAP Noob, but none of the devices I care about have any way to input or output large QR codes. So specifically, the registrar does not have the ability to do that. And while we could make something up new involving flashing the LEDs in the front, I decided that was harder than I wanted to do. Next slide, please. There's some time sequence diagrams. If you really want to go into it, we can discuss it. No time right now. Keep going. Just some other little notes. If you're curious about how we are securing the connection, so fundamentally, this connection from your smartphone to this router is a TLS connection over actually ULA addresses, and we intend to ship the routers with certificates built in with their ULA address already pre-selected and DNS already populated with a name, and therefore we're able to put something in the certificate on the device. So that's the TLS server certificate side of things. How is that side authenticated? You know it's a real device and the name matches. So the problem is, how do we get the TLS client certificate, and why are we using a TLS client certificate? Because we don't want any passwords. Next slide. I don't really think this belongs in ANIMA, yet it leverages all basically an ANIMA protocol. So if not here, then where? And I don't think we have time for that discussion either. Thanks.
Thanks. So yeah, we're done here. So we have 1 minute, so it's too short for any presentations. I close this meeting, and you all are welcome to have more discussing on the recharter in the mailing list, and hopefully we could have our new title by next meeting. Then we could do.
Ignas Bogdanas, on the chat, please really do. The chat is not for the AD, the chat is for the working group.
Sure, yes. Yeah. Okay, so see you all in Prague. Yeah, thank you. Make sure you sign blue sheets. You have one? Yeah.